The stagecoach lurched violently as it navigated the rocky trail through the New Mexico territory, and Georgia Sullivan pressed her face against the window, watching the endless expanse of desert scrub and distant mesas blur past while her heart hammered against her ribs with the terrible certainty that her father's men would catch up to her before nightfall. She had stolen away in the dead of night 3 weeks ago, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and the small leather pouch of money she had been saving since she was 15 years old. Her father, William Sullivan, owned half of Kansas City and had built his empire on the backs of desperate men and women who owed him debts they could never repay. He had decided her fate without consultation, selling her hand in marriage to Marcus Whitmore, a man twice her age with cruel eyes and hands that left bruises on the serving girls who crossed his path. Georgia was 22 years old, and she had spent every one of those years under her father's iron control. But marriage to Marcus would have been a prison worse than any she had known, so she had run. She had run as far as the railroad would take her, then switched to stage coaches, zigzagging across territories to cover her tracks. She knew her father would never stop looking. Men like William Sullivan did not tolerate defiance, especially not from their only daughter. The stage driver called out, and the coach began to slow. Georgia peered through the dust-caked window and saw a small collection of buildings emerging from the landscape. A weathered sign proclaimed it to be Hillsboro, New Mexico territory. The year was 1878, and this town looked like it had been carved out of the harsh desert through sheer stubbornness. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of a modest building with a painted sign that read, General Store and Post Office. Georgia gathered her small carpetbag and stepped down onto the dusty street, squinting in the bright afternoon sun. The town was small, perhaps 24 buildings clustered along a single main street. She could see a saloon, a livery stable, what appeared to be a boarding house, and a church with a white steeple that seemed determined to reach toward heaven despite the desolate surroundings. "This is your stop, miss?" the driver asked, eyeing her with obvious curiosity. A young woman traveling alone was unusual enough to warrant attention, and Georgia knew she needed to avoid drawing notice. "Yes, thank you," she said quietly, reaching into her pouch to pay the fare. Her funds were dwindling faster than she had anticipated. She would need to find work soon, though she had no practical skills beyond embroidery, piano, and the social graces her father had insisted she learn to make herself a suitable ornament for whatever man he chose to bestow her upon. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back up to his seat. Within minutes, the stagecoach was rumbling away, leaving Georgia standing alone on the street with her meager belongings and a growing sense of uncertainty. She had been so focused on running that she had not given much thought to what came after. Now, standing in this dusty frontier town with the sun beating down mercilessly and no clear plan for her future, the magnitude of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. "You look lost, miss." Georgia turned to find a woman standing in the doorway of the general store. She was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair streaked with gray and kind eyes that studied Georgia with maternal concern. "I am a bit lost," Georgia admitted. "I am looking for lodging and perhaps employment if such things are available in Hillsboro." The woman stepped out onto the wooden walkway, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am Clara Martinez. My husband and I run the store. As for lodging, Mrs. Henderson runs the boarding house 2 buildings down. She is a fair woman and keeps clean rooms. Employment is harder to come by, I am afraid." "What skills do you have?" Georgia felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I can read and write. I can keep accounts. I play piano and I am proficient with a needle." Clara's expression softened. "Well, Mrs. Henderson might have use for someone who can help with mending and such." The men around here are hard on their clothes, and Mr. Peterson, who runs the saloon, has been looking for someone who can play the piano. His last pianist left 2 months ago to get married." "A saloon!" Georgia's voice came out smaller than she intended. She had never set foot in such an establishment. "It is not what you might think," Clara said gently. "Mr. Peterson runs a respectable place. No gambling, and he does not tolerate rowdiness. Mostly it is just cowboys coming in for a drink and some company after long days working the ranches. The piano player just provides some music to keep the atmosphere pleasant. You would not be expected to do anything improper." Georgia nodded slowly. She was in no position to be particular about employment. "Thank you. I will speak with both Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Peterson." She found Mrs. Henderson to be a stern but fair woman who agreed to rent her a small room for $2 a week, payable in advance. The room was sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers, but it was clean, and the window looked out over the desert hills that surrounded the town. After paying for 2 weeks, Georgia's funds had dwindled to almost nothing. Mr. Peterson, the saloon owner, was a portly man with an impressive mustache and a shrewd eye for business. He listened to Georgia play a few pieces on his dusty upright piano and nodded approvingly. "You play well, miss. Where did you learn?" "I had tutors back in Missouri," Georgia said, adjusting the truth slightly. She could not risk revealing too much about her background. "Well, I can pay you 50 cents a night, 6 nights a week. You would play from 6 in the evening until midnight with a break for supper around 8. I provide 1 meal on the nights you work. Does that sound agreeable?" It was not much, but combined with whatever mending work she could get from the boarding house residents, it would be enough to survive. "Yes, Mr. Peterson, that sounds agreeable. You can start tonight if you are willing." Georgia agreed, and that evening she found herself seated at the piano in the corner of the surprisingly well-kept saloon, playing the classical pieces she had learned during her privileged upbringing for an audience of weathered cowboys and ranch hands. They were respectful, keeping their distance and occasionally calling out requests. She did not know their songs, but she promised to learn them. The days began to blur together. Georgia fell into a routine of playing at the saloon each evening and spending her days doing mending work for Mrs. Henderson's boarders. She kept to herself, revealing nothing of her past to the curious townspeople. She lived in constant fear that one day her father's men would appear, but as the weeks passed and no one came, she began to breathe a little easier. It was on a Tuesday evening in late September when everything changed. Georgia was playing a slow, melancholic piece by Chopin when the saloon doors swung open and a group of cowboys entered, their boots loud on the wooden floor. She did not look up, having learned that it was better to keep her attention on the keys and avoid eye contact that might be misinterpreted as invitation. "Ethan, you old dog, where have you been?" Mr. Peterson called out cheerfully. "Up at the Wilson Ranch," a deep voice replied. "Been there 6 weeks, helping them move their herd to winter pasture. Figured I had earned a drink." Georgia's fingers continued their practice dance across the keys, but she found herself listening to the conversation despite her better judgment. There was something about the voice, something warm and genuine that stood out against the usual rough talk of the men who frequented the saloon. "Well, you have come back to some changes," Mr. Peterson said. "We have got ourselves a real piano player now. Makes the place almost civilized." "I can hear that," the man named Ethan said. "She plays real pretty." Georgia felt a flush creep up her neck but kept her eyes on the piano. She finished the Chopin piece and transitioned into a simpler melody, one of the folk songs she had learned since coming to Hillsboro. The evening progressed as usual. Men came and went, drinking and talking about weather and cattle and the thousand small concerns that filled their days. Georgia took her break at 8, eating the simple stew Mr. Peterson provided in the back room, then returned to the piano. She was midway through a lively reel when she felt someone watching her. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. The man standing near the bar was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin that spoke of days spent working outdoors. He wore the typical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty denim and a worn cotton shirt, but there was something different about him. His face was striking, with strong features and clear blue eyes that held an unexpected gentleness. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar of his shirt. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, perhaps 25 or 26 years old. What caught her attention most was not his appearance, however, but the way he was looking at her. There was no calculation in his gaze, no inappropriate appraisal. He was simply listening to the music with an expression of genuine appreciation, as though it stirred something in him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Georgia felt something shift inside her chest, a strange flutter she had never experienced before. She quickly looked back down at the keys, her heart racing. She fumbled a note and had to concentrate to get back into the rhythm of the song. When she dared to glance back up, he had turned away and was talking with Mr. Peterson. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was being foolish, but she could not stop herself from occasionally looking in his direction throughout the rest of the evening. At midnight, she finished her final song and began to gather her things. The saloon was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers finishing their drinks. She was wrapping her shawl around her shoulders when a shadow fell across her. "Excuse me, miss." She looked up to find the blue-eyed cowboy standing respectfully a few feet away, his hat in his hands. "I am sorry to bother you," he said, and up close she could hear a slight southern drawl in his voice, something soft and warm like honey. "I just wanted to tell you that your playing tonight was beautiful. I have not heard music like that in a long time." "Thank you," Georgia managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Ethan Walsh," he said, making no move to come closer. "I work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles north of town." "Georgia," she said, then cursed herself for giving her real name. She had been so careful, but something about this man had flustered her. "Georgia," he repeated, as though testing how it sounded. He smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "That is a pretty name." She did not know what to say to that. In her world, men had complimented her beauty, her accomplishments, her father's wealth, but there had always been an undercurrent of transaction to it. This felt different. It felt genuine. "I should go," she said, clutching her shawl tighter. "It is late." "Of course. May I walk you back to your lodgings? It is not safe for a lady to walk alone after dark." Georgia knew she should refuse. Getting close to anyone was dangerous. But there was something in his eyes, something honest and kind, that made her nod before she could think better of it. They walked through the quiet streets of Hillsboro, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Above them, the desert sky was ablaze with more stars than Georgia had ever seen in Kansas City. Ethan maintained a respectful distance, not speaking unless she did, not pushing for conversation. "Have you been in Hillsboro long?" he asked finally. "A few weeks," Georgia said carefully. "Do you like it here?" She considered the question. "It is different from what I am used to, but yes, I think I am beginning to like it. Where are you from originally, if you do not mind me asking?" "Missouri," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "And you?" "Texas originally. My family had a small ranch near San Antonio. I have been working my way around different places since I was 18, learning the trade. Figured I might save up enough to buy my own land someday." There was a dream in his voice when he spoke of owning land, a quiet determination that Georgia recognized. She had dreamed too, though her dreams had always been nebulous things, more about escape than arrival. She had never thought about what she might run toward, only what she was running from. They reached the boarding house too soon. Georgia paused on the front steps, turning to face him. "Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Walsh." "Ethan, please," he said. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Georgia." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I was wondering if I might walk you home again tomorrow evening. I would hate for you to make the walk alone." Georgia knew she should say no. She should keep her distance, maintain her isolation, but she found herself nodding. "I would like that." His smile was radiant. "Then I will see you tomorrow evening." She watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him quickly down the dark street, and wondered what she was doing. She could not afford attachments. She could not afford to let anyone get close enough to ask questions she could not answer. But as she climbed the stairs to her small room, she could not stop thinking about his kind eyes and gentle smile. The next evening, Ethan was waiting outside the saloon when she arrived for work. He tipped his hat to her, wished her a good evening, and said he would be back at midnight to walk her home. Georgia found it difficult to concentrate on her playing, knowing he was somewhere in the saloon listening. This became their pattern. Each evening, Ethan would appear at midnight to walk her back to the boarding house. Their conversation started simple, touching on safe topics like the weather and the town, but gradually deepened. Ethan told her about growing up in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 17, about his dreams of someday owning his own ranch where he could breed good horses. Georgia shared what she could, carefully editing her past. She told him she had come west seeking independence, which was true enough. She told him about learning piano, about her love of reading, about how the vast openness of the desert both frightened and exhilarated her. "You are running from something," Ethan said one night about 2 weeks after they had met. Georgia felt her heart stop. "What makes you say that?" "The way you look over your shoulder sometimes. The way you tense up whenever strangers come into town. The way you never talk about your family." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression gentle. "I am not trying to pry, Georgia. Your past is your business. I just want you to know that whatever you are running from, you are safe here. I would never let anyone hurt you." Tears pricked at Georgia's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. "You do not know what you are saying. You do not know what you might be taking on." "Then tell me," he said simply. And there, standing on the quiet street with starlight spilling down around them, Georgia found herself wanting to trust him. The wall she had built around herself, the careful distance she had maintained, began to crack. "My father is a powerful man," she said slowly. "Very powerful and very wealthy. He arranged for me to marry a man I despised, a cruel man, so I ran. I stole away in the night, and I have been running ever since. If he finds me, he will drag me back, and I will have no choice but to marry the man he chose, or worse." Ethan listened without interrupting, his face grave in the moonlight. "He has resources," Georgia continued, her voice trembling. "Money, men. He could be looking for me right now. Anyone who helps me could be in danger." "Georgia," Ethan said gently, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. "I meant what I said. You are safe here. And if your father's men come looking, they will have to go through me and every decent man in this town. We look after our own in Hillsboro." "But I am not your own," Georgia whispered. "I am just a stranger who plays piano in a saloon." "You are more than that," Ethan said, and his voice was soft but fierce. "At least, you are more than that to me." Georgia looked up at him, at his honest face and kind eyes, and felt something inside her that had been frozen for so long begin to thaw. Ethan, I cannot ask you to put yourself at risk for me. You are not asking. I am offering. He squeezed her hand gently. I know we have not known each other long, but I feel something when I am with you, Georgia, something I have never felt before. Like maybe I have been waiting my whole life to meet you. And if that sounds foolish, well, I have never claimed to be a particularly smart man. A laugh bubbled up from Georgia's chest, surprising her. That does not sound foolish, or if it does, then I am foolish too because I feel it as well. They stood there in the darkness, hands joined, and Georgia felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. Over the following weeks, that hope grew. Ethan courted her in the old-fashioned way, always respectful, always patient. He brought her wildflowers he found on the range. He taught her to ride horses, laughing good-naturedly when she proved clumsy in the saddle at first. She played songs for him in the saloon, learning his favorites. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Georgia found herself falling in love, really and truly in love, for the first time in her life. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She had not known that love could be like this, built on friendship and respect and genuine affection rather than social obligation or financial arrangement. She met Ethan's friends from the ranch, good men who treated her with courtesy and made her laugh with their stories. She became more integrated into the life of Hillsboro, helping Clara at the general store on her free afternoons, attending church on Sundays, slowly letting herself believe that perhaps she could build a real life here. But the fear never fully left her. Every time a stranger rode into town, every time she heard hoofbeats approaching, her heart would race and her palms would grow clammy. She knew her father. William Sullivan was not a man who forgave or forgot. He would be looking for her, and eventually he would find her. It was a cold November evening when her fears materialized. Georgia was playing the piano, lost in a complex piece by Bach, when the saloon doors banged open with more force than necessary. 3 men entered, and there was something about them that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. They were well dressed in a way that stood out in Hillsboro, their clothes expensive and impractical for ranch work. Their eyes swept the room with predatory calculation. Georgia's fingers froze on the keys. She recognized the type of men her father employed. Hard men, dangerous men. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, locked eyes with her. She saw recognition flash across his face, and her blood ran cold. She stood up so quickly the piano bench scraped loudly across the floor. Every eye in the saloon turned to her. Ethan, who had been sitting at a table with some of his ranch friends, was on his feet immediately, his hand dropping instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Georgia," he called, his voice tight with concern. The scarred man smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Georgia Sullivan, your father has been very worried about you." The saloon went quiet. Georgia felt the weight of everyone's attention on her, felt her carefully constructed new life crumbling around her. "I am not going back," she said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. "That is not your decision to make," the scarred man said. "You are coming with us. We can do this easy or hard, but you are coming." Ethan stepped between Georgia and the men, his stance protective. "The lady said she is not going anywhere." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "This is none of your concern, Cowboy. This is family business." "She does not want to go with you," Ethan said, his voice hard as iron. "That makes it my business." One of the other men, a stocky fellow with cold eyes, laughed. "You willing to die for some runaway girl you just met?" "If I have to," Ethan said simply. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Georgia could see other men in the saloon shifting, preparing for trouble. Mr. Peterson had quietly pulled a shotgun from behind the bar. These were good men, but they were ranchers and shopkeepers, not gunfighters. If this turned violent, people would get hurt. "Stop," Georgia said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Please, everyone, just stop." She stepped around Ethan, ignoring his protest, and faced the scarred man directly. "I will not go with you. Tell my father I am of legal age and I have made my choice. I am staying here." "Your father is not a man who takes no for an answer," the scarred man said. "You know that, Georgia. You can make this easy on everyone and come quietly, or we can make it difficult. Either way, you are coming back to Kansas City." "Over my dead body," Ethan said flatly. The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun, and suddenly everything was happening too fast. Ethan drew his weapon with surprising speed, as did several other men in the saloon. The three strangers found themselves facing at least 10 armed men, all of whom looked ready to shoot. "Now, gentlemen," Mr. Peterson said from behind the bar, his shotgun trained on the scarred man, "I think you have overstayed your welcome in my establishment. Miss Georgia has made it clear she does not wish to accompany you. I suggest you leave Hillsboro and tell Mr. Sullivan that his daughter is under the protection of this town." The scarred man looked around the saloon, calculating odds. His companions had their hands on their weapons but had not drawn. They were outnumbered and they knew it. "This is not over," the scarred man said, but he took a step back toward the door. "Mr. Sullivan will not accept this." "Then Mr. Sullivan can come himself and hear the same message," Ethan said. "But he had better come prepared to listen, because Georgia is not going anywhere." The three men backed out of the saloon, their eyes promising future trouble. The moment the doors swung shut behind them, Georgia's legs gave out. Ethan caught her, lowering her gently into a chair. "They will be back," she whispered, trembling. "Or they will send more men. My father will not stop." "Then we will be ready," Ethan said, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands. "Georgia, listen to me. You are not alone anymore. You have friends here, people who care about you. We will face whatever comes together." Mr. Peterson came around the bar. "The lady is right about one thing. If her father is as powerful as she says, this could get ugly. Maybe she should leave town, head further west where he cannot find her." "No," Georgia said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "No more running. I am tired of running. I have found something here, something worth fighting for." She looked up at Ethan, saw the love and determination in his eyes, and felt her resolve harden. "I am staying." "Then we had better prepare," one of the other cowboys said. "If those men report back that the whole town stood against them, Sullivan might try to make an example. We should post guards, keep an eye out for trouble." The men spent the next hour making plans while Georgia sat in stunned silence. These people, who had known her for only a few months, were willing to risk their safety for her. It was humbling and overwhelming and made her love this town, these people, even more. When the saloon finally closed, Ethan walked her back to the boarding house as always. But this time, when they reached her door, he did not simply tip his hat and leave. "Georgia," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I know the timing is probably all wrong for this, and I know we have only known each other a few months, but I cannot wait any longer. I love you. I have loved you since that first night I heard you play piano, maybe before that, maybe since before we even met. And I want you to know that whatever happens, however this situation with your father resolves, I want to be by your side. I want to build a life with you." Tears streamed down Georgia's face, but for once they were not tears of fear. "I love you too, Ethan. I did not think it was possible to feel this way about someone, but you have shown me what real love looks like. You have given me something worth staying for, worth fighting for." He cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was Georgia's first real kiss, and it felt like coming home. "Marry me," Ethan whispered against her lips. "I know I do not have much. I am just a cowboy with dreams of someday owning a little land. But I promise I will spend every day of my life making you happy, keeping you safe, loving you with everything I have." "Yes," Georgia breathed. "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." They were married 3 days later in the small church with the white steeple, with the whole town in attendance. Clara Martinez cried happy tears, and Mrs. Henderson proclaimed it the most romantic thing she had seen in 30 years. Georgia wore a simple dress that Clara helped her make, and Ethan wore his best clothes, and neither of them had ever looked more radiant. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and when Ethan kissed his bride, the small congregation erupted in cheers. For a few perfect hours, Georgia forgot about her father and the danger lurking on the horizon. She was simply a woman in love, married to the man who had shown her what it meant to choose her own destiny. Ethan had saved up enough to rent a small house on the edge of town. It was not much, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but to Georgia it was a palace. That night, as her husband carried her over the threshold and they began their married life together, she felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening. They had 1 week of bliss before William Sullivan arrived. Georgia was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the rumble of approaching horses. She looked up to see a substantial group of riders coming down the main street of Hillsboro, at least 15 men, all armed. At their head rode a man she had hoped never to see again. William Sullivan was 55 years old, powerfully built despite his age, with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of stone. He sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, radiating wealth and authority. When he saw Georgia standing frozen by the clothesline, his expression hardened even further. "Georgia," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Come here, now." Ethan emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion. When he saw the assembled riders, he moved to stand protectively in front of Georgia. "Who are you?" William demanded. "I am Ethan Walsh, sir, Georgia's husband." William's face purpled with rage. "Husband, you dare to marry my daughter without my permission. That marriage is invalid. Georgia is coming back to Kansas City with me, and you will be arrested for kidnapping." "I did not kidnap anyone," Ethan said calmly, though Georgia could see the tension in his shoulders. "Georgia married me of her own free will. We have legal documents." By this time, people were emerging from the buildings along the main street. Mr. Peterson appeared with his shotgun. Clara and her husband joined him. Cowboys from various ranches materialized, drawn by the commotion and ready to defend one of their own. Within minutes, William Sullivan and his men were facing half the population of Hillsboro. "This is absurd," William sputtered. "Georgia, stop this foolishness immediately and come with me. I have already made your excuses to Marcus. He is willing to overlook your disgraceful behavior and still honor the marriage contract." "There is no marriage contract," Georgia said, finding her voice and her courage. She stepped out from behind Ethan to face her father directly. "You cannot sell me like property, father. I am a grown woman and I have made my choice. I am staying here with my husband. I am your father, you will do as I say." "No," Georgia said, and the word felt powerful, liberating. "No, I will not. You never asked me what I wanted, you never considered my happiness. You treated me like a bargaining chip to increase your wealth and influence. Well, I am done being your pawn. I have found a man who loves me for who I am, not for what I can bring him. I have found a place where people care about me as a person. I am happy here, father. For the first time in my life, I am truly happy." William's face went from red to white. "If you do this, you are no daughter of mine. I will cut you off completely. You will never see a penny of my fortune." "I do not want your money," Georgia said, and meant it. I would rather be poor and free than rich and imprisoned. William turned his cold gaze on Ethan. You have poisoned her mind against me. You have stolen my daughter for her inheritance. Sir, with all due respect, I married Georgia not knowing anything about your fortune, Ethan said. I married her because I love her. And if you had taken the time to know your daughter instead of trying to control her, you would understand why she ran. For a long moment, the street was silent except for the whisper of wind through the desert scrub. William Sullivan looked at his daughter, at the determined set of her jaw, at the way she stood close to her husband, drawing strength from his presence. He looked at the assembled townspeople, all of whom were watching him with varying degrees of hostility. You are making a mistake, he said finally, his voice cold as winter ice. Life is hard out here. You will regret this choice, Georgia, and when you do not come crawling back to me. I will not regret it, Georgia said softly. Goodbye, father. William Sullivan turned his horse and rode out of Hillsboro without another word, his hired men following. They watched until the riders disappeared into the shimmering heat haze, and only then did Georgia allow herself to collapse into Ethan's arms, shaking with reaction. It is over, Ethan murmured into her hair. You are free, Georgia. You are finally free. And she was. The weight that had been pressing down on her for as long as she could remember suddenly lifted. She had faced her father and stood her ground. She had chosen her own path. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them on her own terms, with a man who loved her and a community that supported her. That night, lying in bed with Ethan's arms wrapped around her, Georgia felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, running his fingers through her hair. I am thinking about how strange life is, Georgia said. A few months ago, I was running from everything, terrified and alone. I had no idea where I was going or what I would do, and now I am here with you and I have never been happier. I am the lucky one, Ethan said, kissing her forehead. You could have ended up anywhere, but you ended up here. You ended up with me. Do you really think we can make this work? Georgia asked. Your dream of owning land, building something of our own. I know we can, Ethan said with quiet confidence. It will not be easy and it will take time, but we will do it together. I have been saving every penny I earn. In a year or two, we should have enough to buy a small piece of land. We can start with a few horses, build from there. It will be hard work, but it will be ours. Georgia turned in his arms to face him. I want to help. I want to be a true partner, not just a decorative wife. Teach me what I need to know. Ethan smiled, that warm, wonderful smile that never failed to make her heart skip. I will teach you everything. We will build our dream together, Georgia. You and me. Over the following months, that is exactly what they did. Georgia continued playing piano at the saloon most evenings, her earnings adding to their savings. Ethan worked long hours at the Double R Ranch, learning everything he could about raising horses and managing land. On Sundays, their one day off together, Ethan began teaching Georgia about horses, about reading the land, about all the practical skills she would need. She proved to be a quick learner, her determination making up for her initial inexperience. She learned to ride properly, to mend tack, to recognize good horseflesh from poor. She learned about water sources and grazing patterns. She learned to shoot, though she prayed she would never need to use that particular skill. The townspeople of Hillsboro embraced Georgia fully after she stood up to her father. She was no longer an outsider but one of them, part of the community. Clara became like a mother to her, teaching her to cook and preserve food, and all the domestic skills her fancy tutors had never bothered with. Mrs. Henderson taught her about medicinal herbs and tending the sick. Georgia, in turn, helped anyone who needed it, teaching reading to children whose parents could not afford proper schooling. using her accounting skills to help small business owners organize their finances. Winter passed into spring, and spring into summer. Georgia's 23rd birthday came and went, marked by a small celebration with friends. Ethan turned 26 a month later. Their savings grew slowly but steadily, each dollar carefully counted and treasured. It was in late August when Ethan came home with news that made him practically vibrate with excitement. "Georgia, I heard today that old man Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's brother-in-law, is selling his property. It is about 40 acres, 5 miles north of here with a creek running through it and good grazing land. He is asking $800 for it." Georgia's heart leaped. "How much do we have saved?" $735, Ethan said. "I talked to Mr. Henderson, told him our situation. He said if we can come up with $50 down payment, he will hold the land for us and let us pay the rest in installments over the next year." "Oh, Ethan," Georgia threw her arms around his neck. "Our own land." They went to see the property the next day. It was beautiful in a spare, desert sort of way, with rolling hills covered in scrub brush and the precious creek, providing a ribbon of life through the landscape. Georgia could see it as Ethan saw it, could envision the house they would build, the corrals for horses, the life they would create. "It is perfect," she breathed. They made the down payment that week and suddenly they were landowners, bound to Hillsboro and to each other, and to this piece of earth in a way that made Georgia's heart swell. She had never owned anything before, not really. Everything in her old life had belonged to her father. But this land, this dream, was hers and Ethan's alone. They could not afford to build a house immediately, so they continued living in the rented place in town while Ethan spent every spare moment working on their property. He built a small stable first, then corrals. In October, he bought their first 2 horses, a mare and a young stallion with good bloodlines, using the last of their savings. "This is the beginning," he told Georgia, watching the horses explore their new home. "In a few years, we will have a whole herd. We will be known for breeding the finest horses in New Mexico territory." Georgia believed him. She had learned that when Ethan set his mind to something, he made it happen. That winter, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. She had been feeling tired and slightly ill for weeks before Clara gently suggested the possibility. The confirmation filled Georgia with a complex swirl of emotions: joy, fear, excitement, terror. She was going to be a mother. She was going to bring a child into this world, into this hard but beautiful life she and Ethan were building. When she told Ethan, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. Then he set her down carefully as though she were made of glass and placed his hand over her still flat stomach with an expression of wonder. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Georgia asked, needing to hear it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Ethan said. "You have given me everything, Georgia. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Georgia continued working, though she had to give up the piano playing in her 7th month when sitting on the bench became too uncomfortable. The townswomen rallied around her, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and offering to help when the time came. In May of 1880, Georgia gave birth to a healthy baby boy in the small rented house, with Mrs. Henderson and Clara in attendance. The labor was long and difficult, but when Ethan was finally allowed into the room and took his son in his arms for the first time, Georgia knew it had all been worth it. They named him James, after Ethan's father. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from his first day he was loved beyond measure. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, taking to the role with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He would rock James for hours when the baby was fussy, would change diapers without complaint, would sing old cowboy songs in his gentle drawl until their son fell asleep. "I never knew I could love someone so much," he confessed to Georgia one night, watching James sleep in the cradle he had built with his own hands. "I love you more than life itself, and now there is this little person who is half you and half me, and I would do anything to keep him safe and happy." "You are a wonderful father," Georgia said, leaning against his shoulder. "Our son is lucky to have you." Having a baby made everything both harder and more meaningful. Their savings had taken a hit with the medical expenses, setting back their plans, but Georgia found she did not mind. Every time she looked at James, every time she saw Ethan's face light up at their son's toothless smile, she knew they had everything that truly mattered. By the time James was 6 months old, they had saved enough to start building a modest house on their land. It was not large, just 4 rooms, but Ethan built it solid and true with his own hands and the help of friends from town. In November of 1880, they finally moved out to their property, into their own home. Georgia stood on the porch of their new house, holding James in her arms, watching the sun set over the desert hills that were now theirs, and felt tears of gratitude slip down her cheeks. 2 years ago, she had been running, terrified and alone. Now she had a husband she adored, a beautiful son, land of her own, and a future full of possibilities. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around both her and James. "I am thinking about how far we have come," Georgia said. "I am thinking that I was running from everything, and you gave me something worth running to. You gave me a reason to stop running and start living." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "We gave each other that, Georgia. We built this together." The years that followed were filled with hard work and simple joys. Their horse breeding operation grew slowly but steadily. Ethan's eye for good horses proved sound, and their stock gained a reputation for quality. Money was always tight, but they always had enough. James grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler who loved following his father around the property. Georgia had her hands full keeping up with him while also helping with the horses and maintaining their home. It was exhausting and wonderful, and nothing like the life she had been raised to expect. When James was 2 years old, Georgia became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the spring of 1883, she gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth after Ethan's mother. Elizabeth was a quieter baby than James had been, with solemn dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. James was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything, and Ethan walked around with a permanent smile now that he had both a son and a daughter. "Our family is complete," he said, holding Elizabeth while James climbed onto his lap as well. "I have everything I ever wanted right here." Georgia had to agree. Though life was not always easy, though there were hard winters and dry summers and animals that got sick and 1,000 daily challenges, she had never been happier. She had freedom. She had love. She had a partner who treated her as an equal. She had children who were growing up knowing they were cherished. What more could anyone ask for? The years continued to pass. James and Elizabeth grew, learning to ride almost before they could walk, becoming capable helpers around the ranch. The horse operation expanded. They were able to hire a young man to help with the work, freeing up time for Ethan to focus on the breeding program and for Georgia to take on more of the business management. Georgia had discovered she had a talent for the business side of things, keeping meticulous records and developing relationships with buyers. Together, she and Ethan made a formidable team. Their reputation grew, and horses bearing the Walsh brand became sought after throughout New Mexico Territory and beyond. By 1888, when Georgia was 32 and Ethan was 35, they had built something substantial. Their original 40 acres had grown to 200 through careful purchases. They had a fine herd of horses and a comfortable home. They had saved enough that money was no longer a constant worry. James was 8 years old, already showing signs of becoming a fine horseman like his father. Elizabeth, at 5, was quieter but no less capable, with a gift for gentling even the most skittish animals. They were good children, kind and hardworking, and Georgia was immensely proud of them. One evening in late summer, after the children had been tucked into bed, Georgia and Ethan sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of each day. "You ever regret it?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Giving up the life you could have had? The wealth, the comfort?" Georgia turned to look at her husband. He was older now, lines creasing his face from years of sun and hard work, but to her he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. And more importantly, he was the best man she had ever known. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "That life was a beautiful cage, Ethan. This life, our life, is freedom. Every day I get to make choices. Every day I get to work toward something that matters. Every day I am surrounded by people I love who love me in return. How could I possibly regret that?" "I just want you to be happy," Ethan said, taking her hand. "I am happy," Georgia assured him. "Ethan, you gave me everything. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You showed me what real love looks like. You made me brave enough to stop running and start building. I am happier than I ever imagined possible." Ethan squeezed her hand. "I love you, Georgia Walsh, more today than yesterday, and I will love you even more tomorrow." "And I love you," Georgia said. "Thank you for being worth running to." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars multiplied overhead. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life worth living. In the years that followed, the Walsh ranch continued to thrive. James grew into a responsible young man who loved working with horses as much as his father did. Elizabeth developed into a talented artist who could capture the beauty of the desert landscape in sketches and paintings. When she was 16, a gallery owner passing through Hillsboro saw her work and offered to show some of her pieces in Santa Fe. Elizabeth's paintings began to sell, providing her with her own income and a growing reputation. Georgia and Ethan watched their children grow with pride, knowing they had given them the freedom to pursue their own dreams, the very freedom Georgia herself had been denied as a young woman. In 1895, when Georgia was 39 and Ethan 42, they received unexpected news. Georgia's father had died. A lawyer from Kansas City tracked her down to inform her that, despite his threats to disinherit her, William Sullivan had left his entire fortune to his only daughter. Georgia and Ethan traveled to Kansas City to settle the estate, their first time leaving New Mexico in 17 years. The city seemed strange and foreign to Georgia now, too crowded and noisy after years in the open desert. The house she had grown up in felt more like a museum than a home. They learned that her father had never remarried after her mother's death when Georgia was young. He had poured all his energy into building his business empire, dying alone and bitter in the mansion filled with expensive things but devoid of love. The lawyer explained that William Sullivan had amended his will 5 years earlier, leaving everything to Georgia with a note that simply said, "You were right. I was wrong. I hope you found the happiness I could not give you." It was the closest thing to an apology her father could manage, and Georgia felt a complicated mix of sadness and relief. She grieved for the relationship they might have had if he had been a different man, but she could not regret the choices that had led her to the life she loved. The inheritance was substantial, more money than Georgia and Ethan could spend in several lifetimes. They could have moved back to Kansas City, lived in luxury, had servants and fine clothes and all the trappings of wealth. Instead, they returned to Hillsboro and their ranch. They used some of the money to expand their operation further, to build better facilities, to help their children pursue their dreams. James, now 23, wanted to start a breeding program for cattle in addition to the horses. They provided him with the capital to do so. Elizabeth, at 20, wanted to study art in Europe. They made that possible for her, but mostly they gave the money away. They built a proper school in Hillsboro, hired qualified teachers so that children in the area could get a real education. They funded a library and a better medical facility. They helped struggling ranchers get through hard times, provided loans to young people trying to start businesses, supported families who had fallen on misfortune. Money is just a tool, Ethan said when some people questioned their generosity. It can build walls or it can build bridges. We choose bridges. The people of Hillsboro, who had sheltered and protected Georgia when she needed it most, benefited from that choice. The town grew and prospered, and the Walsh family was at the heart of it. In 1898, James married a lovely young woman named Sarah from a neighboring ranch. They built a house on Walsh land and began their own family. In 1900, they gave Georgia and Ethan their first grandchild, a boy they named Ethan after his grandfather. Elizabeth returned from Europe in 1901, her talent refined by study with master painters. She had fallen in love with a fellow artist, a kind man named Thomas who treated her like the treasure she was. They married in the small church in Hillsboro, where Georgia and Ethan had wed 20 years earlier, bringing everything full circle. Elizabeth and Thomas settled in Santa Fe but visited often, and soon they too had children to add to the growing Walsh family. Georgia's hair began to gray at the temples, and Ethan's joints grew stiff from years of hard work, but they were content. They had built something lasting, not just a ranch but a legacy of family and community and love. On a warm evening in June of 1905, Georgia and Ethan sat on the porch of their home, now expanded and improved, but still the same house he had built with his own hands 25 years earlier. They were both 50 years old now, their children grown and thriving, their grandchildren bringing new joy to their lives. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had chosen differently that night?" Ethan asked. "If you had just kept running instead of stopping in Hillsboro?" Georgia considered the question. "Sometimes, I think about all the things I would have missed, you, our children, this life. It terrifies me how easily I could have made a different choice." "I am glad you stopped running," Ethan said, pulling her close. "I am glad you chose to stay, to build something instead of just escaping." "You gave me a reason to stay," Georgia said. "You showed me that life could be different. You taught me that love was not about control or obligation but about partnership and respect and choosing each other every day." "We chose well," Ethan said, kissing her forehead. They sat together as the sun set over the land they had built their life on, surrounded by the evidence of the choices they had made. They could hear James and Sarah's children playing in the yard of the nearby house. They could see the horses grazing peacefully in the fields, the culmination of decades of careful breeding. They could feel the weight of years well lived, of a love that had only deepened with time. Georgia thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Hillsboro 27 years ago, running from everything and toward nothing. She thought about the moment when a kind cowboy with blue eyes had offered to walk her home, how that simple act of consideration had been the beginning of everything good in her life. She had been running from a future that would have destroyed her spirit. Ethan had given her something worth running to, a future they built together with their own hands and hearts. He had taught her that she was strong enough to stop running, brave enough to stand and fight for what mattered, capable enough to create the life she wanted rather than accepting the one others tried to impose on her. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Ethan asked. "For everything. For loving me. For being patient when I was afraid. For giving me a reason to believe in tomorrow. For building this beautiful life with me." "Georgia, you have nothing to thank me for," Ethan said softly. "You did all that yourself. I just had the good fortune to be there when you were ready." But Georgia knew better. She had needed him, needed his strength and gentleness and unwavering belief that she deserved better than what she had been given. He had been her anchor when she was adrift, her courage when she was afraid, her home when she was lost, and she had been the same for him. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone. They had turned fear into courage, flight into fight, desperation into determination. They had taken the broken pieces of who they might have been and forged them into something whole and strong and lasting. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Georgia leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt complete contentment wash over her. She had everything she needed right here. A man who loved her as an equal, children who were making their own way in the world, grandchildren to carry their legacy forward, land that would sustain future generations, and a community that had become family. She was no longer running from anything. She had found exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a cowboy who had shown her that the greatest adventure was not in escaping but in building, not in fleeing but in standing firm, not in running but in choosing to stay and fight for the life and love you wanted. The Wild West had been everything the stories said, hard, unforgiving, beautiful, and free, but it had also been something more. It had been the place where Georgia Sullivan became Georgia Walsh, where a frightened runaway became a confident woman, where desperation transformed into determination, where a chance meeting in a dusty frontier town became a love story that would be told by their grandchildren and great-grandchildren for generations to come. It was the place where she stopped running and started living, where she found not just a place to hide but a place to thrive, not just a man to marry but a true partner to share her life with, not just survival but joy and purpose and belonging. The desert breeze whispered through the evening air, carrying with it the scent of sage and horses and home. Ethan's arm was warm around her shoulders, solid and real and forever. And Georgia knew with absolute certainty that every choice she had made, every risk she had taken, every moment of fear and courage and hope had led her exactly where she was meant to be. She had been running from everything. He had given her something worth running to. And together, they had built something worth staying for. A life filled with love, purpose, family, and the kind of happiness that comes from choosing your own path and walking it hand in hand with someone who sees you, truly sees you, and loves what they see. As darkness settled over the New Mexico landscape, and the stars blazed overhead in their thousands, Georgia Walsh closed her eyes and smiled, grateful beyond measure for the cowboy who had walked her home one autumn night and changed everything. She was finally, truly, completely home.